Ladies and gentlemen, the 24th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Admiral Robert J. Papp.
Well, good evening, shipmates. It's nice to be able to be in front of a crowd that understands that term, and this is one of those crowds. Because traditionally we use the term shipmate as one of a greeting of respect and real affection. It's a recognition of shared experiences, of a love for the sea and for seafaring, and of the unique bond that's formed between those who have served in ships and faced both the wonder and the hardships that are part of going to sea. Those people who understand what it's like to carry out a mission when you're cold, wet, and tired. I'm proud to be here tonight to present the Lone Sailor Award to one of our own shipmates in the Coast Guard, James David Power III, known to you, most of you as J.D. Power, but known to the officers of his old wardroom as simply Dave. And it's been great to meet the entire family of Joan and Jamie, Mary, and daughter Susan, who actually served in the Coast Guard as well. It's great to meet all of you. Now, I confirmed that it was Dave in the wardroom because I called up an old shipmate this morning, retired Rear Admiral Ted Wojner, who was in fact a junior officer in the wardroom with Mr. Power. And when I talked to him this morning and I kept on saying Mr. Power, he said, "You better call him Dave. He will want to be called Dave." So we'll do that, sir, with your permission. As all of you know, Dave Power had an incredibly successful life and career, and we're fortunate that he made the Coast Guard a part of that career. Now, Ensign Power actually started out in sort of a ensign pulver experience, assigned all those collateral duties that a junior officer gets, like the commissary officer, the exchange officer, and others. But he wasn't an ensign pulver, he was an ensign power, and I think that has a great ring to it. Just think if he went in another direction. Admiral Power, that almost sounds like an action hero. But he spent the majority of the time in his Coast Guard aboard the Coast Guard cutter, a polar icebreaker, Eastwind. And she was a remarkable cutter with a career as storied and as accomplished as his. While aboard the Eastwind, Dave Power made trips to both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and in fact, at one point, he spent 10 months out of 12 out at sea. He was the navigator aboard the Eastwind as they took part in the very first Operation Deep Freeze, the United States mission to establish a permanent station in Antarctica and to conduct scientific and mapping operations. This mission was accompanied by the famous polar explorer, Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, on his fifth and final trip to the Antarctic. David Power was there for that, helping to carve a path through the ice. And as what happens with most of us, his ship and his shipmates carved a place in his heart. He's always remembered his time aboard Eastwind, and he was instrumental in providing for the establishment of the Eastwind Association. And he still supports and attends Eastwind crew reunions regularly. And by the way, not only was Dave Power respected by the crew of Eastwind, but I understand he was also great for morale. In fact, I'm told that Jimmy Stewart imitation by Rich Little pales in comparison to the Jimmy Stewart imitation that he used to do. And Ted Wojner actually told me that he played John Wayne to Dave Power's Jimmy Stewart when they went out on Liberty. But the other thing that Ted Wojner told me this morning was, out of all the junior officers that he ever met, including his fellow Academy graduates and other OCS graduates, Dave Power was top shelf. Dave Power was top notch. Lieutenant Power finished his Coast Guard career on the Coast Guard cutter Cactus, a seagoing buoy tender, and the first of a relatively new class at the time. It was only 13-year-olds when he served on it. A class of ship that this Coast Guard would sail for well over 50 years, and in fact a sister ship of my first cutter in the Coast Guard, albeit a few years later. Dave Power has been a part of many great moments in the life of the Coast Guard, and I know from talking to him, from his continued involvement in the Eastwind Association, that this was an important time in his life as well. And he has my personal thanks for helping to sustain the history and for continuing to honor the legacy of his ship and her crew. I've been talking to Coast Guard men and women a lot lately about three attributes that I think are vitally important and essential for the people who serve in the Coast Guard. The first is proficiency of your craft. The second, proficiency of leadership. And then third, disciplined initiative. I think you'll agree that Dave Power epitomizes those three traits, as well as the Coast Guard's core values of honor, respect, and devotion to duty. So as I mentioned earlier, shipmates is a term of great respect for those who have served at sea in ships. One of my great honors as the Commandant of the Coast Guard is to be able to speak on behalf of all the men and women in the United States Coast Guard when I say that we are very proud that you are one of our shipmates. And I'm happy to be here tonight to recognize you not only for your service to the nation as a member of the United States Coast Guard, but for all the many remarkable accomplishments that followed your time in the Coast Guard. So thank you for your service, sir. Semper Paratus, and let's go to the video.